This is the Ronin of Philosophy, where I take a look at ideas, metaphysical concepts, and social constructs, and try to examine them from a philosophical point of view. Conservative is one of the several trigger words in today's society that instantly throws people into a defensive posture, whether they are for it or against it. And there are numerous stereotypes that can fill in the blanks in people's minds for this. Supporters become defensive because they sense that they now must defend their position. They often communicate non-verbally that they feel that they are about to be attacked for their position and for not supporting more progressive values. While in contrast, the opposition feels defensive for similar reasons because conservative support had helped usher in a very conservative president in 2016. This in turn has also made progressives more aggressive as well. The interesting thing to me, however, is a misunderstanding people have of what conservatives are. Again, because it's a trigger word, conservative automatically brings to mind pictures of pre-Vietnam cultural values. You probably know what I'm getting at. Women working in the homes and men working at work and knowing the best for the family. All the while, usually presented as being white with an apple pie image as well. Your standard Leave It to Beaver scenario. However, this could not be further from the truth, with the reality being something even I find somewhat unsettling. The stereotype of the right would have been largely correct if this was the 1950s, 60s, or 70s. That was the Depression and World War II era generation. 20 years of trial and tribulation with little respite for grassroots, social revolution, and change. Social changes were unstable, and the country couldn't afford more instability during those times. This was, of course, despite the fact that it was already happening, with women flooding factories and piloting planes to the front lines, while non-white races actively fighting on the war front, and jazz music already starting to change the way mainstream society enjoyed itself. Yet, that was the reflection that they chose to believe, the self-image they saw when they looked in the mirror. During the post-war years, however, conservatives tried to put Pandora back in her box. The values of the right originally revolved around this, intertwined with politics, religion, and patriotism. It prized self-motivation and do-it-yourself attitudes, as vets came back and started their own businesses and built new homes in the expanding suburbs. It placed the family unit and the good of the society that they fought to save and preserve as a priority. And this society was held in place by the family unit, good morals, and a solid democratic morals and values, along with capitalism and a powerful religious base. Not that everyone behaved like this all the time, but this was the face people wanted to be seen. That was stability in their eyes. Anything that deviated from these norms was considered hostile. Communism and socialism especially fell under this red gaze, since opposition to everything above was their manifesto, with the Soviet Union, North Korea, and China embodying these very tenets. TV shows, religion, and politics further reflected back the mentality. Yet, they failed to hide the reality that Pandora's box refused to be closed. New ideas, values, and long postponed justice became louder and louder and has continued to this day. And this, I believe, was the birth of the American Culture War. To those who did not come up during the hardships of the previous decades, they did not see stability that conventionally had supported them economically, by the way. They saw oppression, prejudice, and injustice that had long gone unanswered and made excuses for. And since then, there has always been hostility between the two factions, each accusing the other of ruining American society. It was after the 1970s and 80s, however, that conservatism resurged from the social upheaval of the previous decades, but for entirely different reasons. The greatest generation were now grandparents. However, their children were the rebels and hippies of the Vietnam era and had now flipped sides. When people picture Vietnam in the 1960s and 70s, they picture young people with long hair, bell bottoms, and crazy drugs and sex orgies fighting for freedom, justice, and peace. However, by the mid-1970s, the people who craved freedom, free love, and peace, and upsetting the man, now wanted the same stability as their social opponents did back in the day. 10 years of open public strife, along with the Vietnam War, had exhausted the country. This new wave of conservatism was not its predecessor, however. though it shared several common traits. The main differences lay in that they were still somewhat more tolerant of certain activities and lifestyles, such as in music and movies and technology, than the previous generation were. They did not demand a total purge of their existence from American life, not too surprisingly, given that they were the ones who set the groundwork for that in the first place. It was not perfect tolerance, mind you, but it was more than what had come before. There was also a desire to change and live healthier lifestyles and enjoy life more. Yet, many of the previous tropes did transfer over as well, such as resistance to flaunting alternative lifestyles, reactionary tendencies to anything they felt promoted violence and instability, and even an upsurge in religion. Unabashed patriotism also saw upsurge as well, especially during the 1980s. However, there was still some skepticism, and this brand of conservative values was more focused on gaining your success through your own actions. Religious beliefs were not a requirement anymore, though for many it still played an important part and could still swing a vote. However, all this stalled after 1985. During the 1990s and into double O's, these new breed of conservatives found themselves back in conflict with a new generation of progressives that were more educated in the errors of the past and wanted to correct them as well. Just as the conservatives of the 90s and double O's were not the conservatives of their grandparents' or parents' era, these new progressive liberals were not the liberals of their parents' era from the 1960s and early 70s as well. A new wave of aforementioned progressive values like environmentalism and feminism were making a resurgence in society, but demanding more as well. Non-traditional communities and minorities now wanted more change and social acceptance that was up front and not just in the background or sparsely seen as well. They wanted their rights and choices protected and for society to recognize them for who they were and not what the stereotypes thrust upon them or keep them in the shadows. The HIV crisis and open revelation of police brutality even further inflamed this aspect of the conflict. Many conservatives initially blamed liberal politics and values for the raising chaos, leading to hate crimes and prejudice. In turn, many progressives socially retaliated, showing that education did not match their ideas and that it did not justify Nazi-style violence upon them. Throughout these changes, the conservatives overall were still largely seen as their original predecessors from the post-World War II era. The nuances and changes in its membership appeared to be ignored, and I believe that this was in detriment to progressives and leftists. You see, the conservatives that progressives are dealing with today, and have been dealing with for the last 30 years, are people who were once them. The hippies, anti-war protesters, and even later Gen Xers who, for various reasons, ultimately found themselves falling back in line with the very values they once rallied against. While they still maintained many liberal principles from their youth, it was okay so as long as it remained out of their backyard. Right or wrong, their mentality is one of been there, done that, and nothing that millennials or Gen Zers bring to the table is going to be anything different. Ironically, it's because of this idea that right-wingers and traditionalists often fall back to the old criticisms of their ancestors, that these kids are spoiled and entitled. I see it all the time online and in social media, and many times am reminded of it in that they too were once referred to this way. Another change that many conservatives had held on to, but has now become a problem, is racism. Most conservatives will oppose racism to some degree. Many voted for Barack Obama when he first ran for president. They would be against minorities not given a fair shot at a job based on their skin color. However, they would be more hesitant to call out police brutality, policies that specifically targeted groups from entering the country, or standing up for the protection of gay citizens under direct assault. This straddling of the fence is already an issue by itself, but now, after the election of Donald Trump, many far-right groups are now starting to align themselves with conservative values overall, and has gotten to the point where the outsiders, there's little difference between neo-Nazis, the KKK, and Republicans. Regardless, the mistake of seeing conservatives as their original incarnation that few of us were even around to see causes socially active progressives to react out of ignorance. They cast stereotypes that in many cases do not apply anymore. misunderstandings are created where otherwise they might be able to find common ground and to make some headway overall together. The most detrimental aspect, though, is that it furthers a desire among conservatives to reject dialogue because they find leftist projections of them as insulting as a result of a lazy mind. And while this is by no means a one-sided affair, it does contribute to an overall ignorance of Americans who tend to view each other through the lenses of past societies rather than through who they are now.